I want to thank everyone for tuning in today for the second day of our fall speaker series. So today's first event is presented by the American Solidarity Party of Cascadia. The topic is Distributism with guest Thomas Storck. This event was recorded about a month or 6 weeks ago. So I want to thank Jeremy Miller and John Montgomery for their work in putting this together. And without further ado, we can play the recording and you guys can hear what Thomas had to share with us.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm John Montgomery, and I'm the chair for the Cascadia Solidarity Party, and we're happy to have this lecture. Jeremy, would you like to introduce?
Yeah. So tonight we have with us Thomas Storck. He's a 1978 convert to the Catholic faith and has been writing on Catholic social teaching and Catholic culture and history since the early 80s. He received his undergraduate degree from Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, and an MA from St. John's College in Santa Fe. He is the author, editor, or translator of 10 books. His articles have appeared in New Oxford Review, the Chesterton Review, the Distributism Review, and elsewhere, and he is a contributing editor of New Oxford Review and a member of the editorial board of the Chesterton Review. Mr. Storck is married to Inez Storck and has 4 children and 15 grandchildren. Thank you very much, Thomas, for being here tonight.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the Cascadian ASP and everybody else here tonight. So I will be talking about distributism this evening, but also about the whole subject of economics, because as you will see, distributism is more about than just a rearrangement of who has power in the economy and who is able to receive a just return for his input. But in its fullness, it fosters a different understanding of economics and the economy from that which is the result of several centuries of capitalism and indoctrination into capitalist ways of thinking. Now, the platform of the American Solidarity Party states, quote, "We advocate creating a society of widespread ownership or distributism," unquote. Well then, what is distributism? Although distributism originated in the early part of the last century, and in the 1920s and 30s, distributists were very active in Great Britain and to a lesser extent in the US. Afterwards, for decades, it was more or less forgotten or even scorned. For example, the New Catholic Encyclopedia, which appeared in 1967, opined that distributists, quote, "diverted part of a generation of intelligent people into a dream world, presented an interpretation of Catholic social doctrine that was alien to the outlook of the times, and became a barrier between the faith and the masses," unquote. Then, surprisingly, a revival of distributist thinking and writing began just before the turn of the millennium, manifested in articles, books, debates, conferences. So although the term distributism is much better known today, there is still considerable confusion, even among those who are well disposed toward creating a society of widespread ownership, about exactly what it is and what it entails for our economic life and practices. There are some who liken it to socialism, usually opponents, while on the other hand, there are even those who claim that it is a form of libertarianism. So I'll try to deal tonight with some of these questions and some of the possible confusions that might exist in some minds. Let me begin by stating 2 different ways of thinking about distributism. One, a more or less formal definition, the other a description that at first sight might appear rather too vague. But I think that taken together, they can bring out different aspects of distributism. And I hope that when considered together, they will help make our subject clearer. The first is from an article written in 1917 by G.K. Chesterton's younger brother, Cecil Chesterton. He wrote, "A distributist is a man who desires that the means of production should, generally speaking, remain private property, but that their ownership should be so distributed that the determining mass of families, ideally every family, should have an efficient share therein. That is distributism, and nothing else is distributism. Distributism is quite as possible in an industrial or commercial as an agrarian community," unquote. And the second is from the late Father Ian Boyd, founding editor of the Chesterton Review, Father Boyd once called distributism a different rhythm of life. At first glance, it might not be clear how these two statements fit together, but I think that both of them are important for getting a good grasp both of what distributism is and of the different approach to economic life that it can foster, different from that which has been inculcated and fostered by capitalism in the last 250 years or so. The first definition, that of Cecil Chesterton, points to the formal structural aspect of distributism. In order to understand the importance of this, why this is crucial, we have first to ask what capitalism is. Sometimes capitalism is equated simply with private property or private property and means of production. On the other hand, sometimes it is understood as the domination of the economy by a few owners or controllers of wealth or by corporations. And although I think that this latter is the almost inevitable result of capitalism, it does not, in my opinion, get at the key point of capitalism. What is that key point? Pope Pius XI, in his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno of 1931, defined the capitalist system as, quote, that economic system in which were provided by different people the capital and labor jointly needed for production, unquote. In other words, under capitalism, the economy is characterized by a disjunction or separation between the owners of the means of production and those who receive a wage or salary working on the enterprises owned by capitalists. Now, considered abstractly, this separation of ownership and work is not unjust, for as long as the capitalist pays a just wage and observes appropriate safety standards, there is nothing inherently wrong in hiring a person to work for you. If an elderly grandmother hires a teenager next door to mow her lawn, then that's an instance of a capitalist economic arrangement, but usually not one we have to worry much about. But when capitalist practices come to characterize and control the entire economy, that is another matter altogether. And here's where the danger arises. And this is for two reasons. At the very beginning of modern Catholic social teaching, Leo XIII spoke in Rerum Novarum of, quote, the party which holds the power because it holds the wealth, which has in its grasp all labor and all trade, which manipulates for its own benefit and its own purposes all the sources of supply, and which is powerfully represented in the councils of the state itself, unquote. In other words, with rare exceptions, it is the owners, or in some cases the managers, of the means of production who call the shots in the economy. And in a capitalist economy, only with the support of the state or of strong labor unions have workers ever been able to obtain their fair share in the fruits of economic activity. Naturally, those who hold such massive economic power, that is, capitalists, also possess vast political power, for not only are they able to make immense financial contributions to politicians, but they usually are the ones who control or own most of the media organs. So although in the US, we have an establishment media that by and large leans toward what we call the left, actually they do not threaten the fundamental capitalist structure of American society. Instead, they divert our attention by keeping the public divided and therefore politically impotent under the old program of divide and conquer. Moreover, these owners and controllers of wealth will use their political power to enhance their economic power. For example, fostering war and the fear of war in order to sell more armaments. But there is a second way that this separation of ownership and work is harmful to society, what has been called the spirit of capitalism. This concerns how our economic arrangements affect our understanding of what the economy is all about. This in turn will shape our attitudes towards consumption, property, work and leisure, marriage, and in fact, probably every single aspect of our lives. Now, it should be obvious that the entire reason for the existence of the economy is to supply people with the goods and services needed for a reasonable human life. The economy is a subordinate to society. It exists to serve society. But the separation of ownership and work fosters a different attitude. This was very well put by one of the original distributists, Hilaire Belloc, when he wrote, but wealth obtained indirectly as profit out of other men's work or by process of exchange becomes a thing abstracted from the process of production. As the interest of a man in things diminishes, his interest in abstract wealth, money, increases. The man who makes a table or grows a crop makes the success of the crop or the table a test of excellence. The intermediary who buys and sells the crop or the table is not concerned with the goodness of table or crop, but with the profit he makes between their purchase and sale. In a productive society, the superiority of the things produced is the measure of success. In a commercial society, the amount of wealth accumulated by the dealer is the measure of success. End of quote. Consider someone who opens a small brewery or any kind of small business. Usually he will be motivated by more than one thing. Certainly by a desire to make a living, yes, but almost always by a love of his craft, a desire to provide a good product to the public at a reasonable price. In such a case, ownership is not separated from work. The same person is both owner and worker. But when ownership and work are separated, there exists a class of persons who are removed from the actual productive work of the business, and they will tend to regard the business, and indeed the entire economy, not as a means of supplying the public with quality goods at fair prices, but as simply a means of selling something and thereby amassing wealth for themselves. The further removed they are from the actual product and the productive process, the less interest they have in the real economy, for the product becomes for them simply a means of making a profit, a commodity. In fact, in the most developed form of capitalism, the corporation, the legal owners of the corporation, the shareholders, often have little or no knowledge of or interest in the actual product of the firm of which they are the owners, so long as their dividend checks keep coming or the stock price rises. And many of these shares are held by mutual funds or pension funds, introducing a further layer of separation between the actual production of a product and those who, in one way or another, are its legal owners. And still further, considering that shares of stock change hands by the minute on Wall Street and other stock exchanges, it is a little unreal even to speak of the owners of a corporation in any real sense. It is false to say that someone who owns a share of stock is an owner in the same way that a small farmer or small business owner is an owner. The word may be the same, but the meaning is very different. In a commercial society, the amount of wealth accumulated by the dealer is a measure of success, wrote Belloc. This tendency to see accumulation of wealth as a standard of success has had immense influence, not just in the economy itself, but on all society. It has fostered the notion that instead of the economy having the inherent purpose of serving mankind's needs, it exists for the private purposes of whoever holds sufficient economic power. This, in turn, as I already noted, has affected our entire life as a society, including our views and practices concerning marriage, children, education, technology, our treatment of the natural world, the very food that we eat. Our attitude toward higher education is a signal case in point. The discussion about whether it is advisable to pursue a college degree is almost always framed in terms of the cash value of the degree, of its return on investment. Would you be better off investing your tuition money and going directly into the job market? Seldom is there any serious consideration of any other reason for going to college. Learning to think clearly, being initiated into a great cultural and intellectual tradition, even becoming a more thoughtful citizen. These are seldom mentioned, except perhaps in an occasional commencement address. This, however, is nothing new in this country. In 1941, Theodore Maynard, in his History of Catholicism in the United States, wrote that in no other country in the world can first-rate doctors and lawyers be encountered who know nothing outside of their own profession. Culture, not having a cash value, is disesteemed, unquote. Now, on a formal level, then, distributism seeks to eliminate the separation between ownership and work by making workers owners and owners workers. In its ideal form, this would be by small businesses, small workshops, small farms, owned and operated by individuals or families, with few, if any, hired employees, except for apprentices who are learning the particular trade. But since this is not always practicable, especially given the state of technology, in the case of enterprises that by their nature must be large, distributism would favor worker ownership, worker-owned cooperatives, or worker-owned businesses of some kind. There is no reason why even the most technically complex enterprise could not be run as an employee-owned business, as the example of the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain illustrates. In this way, it will be workers, including managers, all those actually involved in the production of useful goods and services, who will possess economic power and receive their fair share of economic rewards. Hitherto, the big obstacle to more workers obtaining economic power in this way has been that they lacked the necessary capital to start a business. But this is not an insuperable obstacle. In their unfortunately misnamed 1958 volume, The Capitalist Manifesto by Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler, and as a follow-up in the 1994 book, Curing World Poverty, published by Social Justice Review in St. Louis, there is set out a feasible plan by which those without capital will be able to borrow necessary startup funds based upon the future profits of their enterprise. These loans, moreover, could be guaranteed by the government and obtain a lower rate of interest thereby. So there is no reason why workers cannot become owners. If small businesses, family farms, and worker-owned enterprises receive favorable tax treatment, then their number might increase, and gradually our economy would take on some of the characteristics of distributism. Before I go on to talk about Father Boyd's characterization of distributism as a different rhythm of life, let me deal with a couple of specific questions about distributism that have been raised. Now, the first concerns labor unions. Above, I mentioned that unions have been one important way in which workers in a capitalist economy have managed to achieve some measure of economic justice, and this is true. In a capitalist economy, where owners tend to see their employees as primarily cost items, unions will be necessary to overcome some of the disparity in power between employers and employees. But in a distributist economy, this would not be the case. Obviously, in a family-owned business, there would be no need for unions, and in a larger cooperative enterprise, this would also be the case. For if the workers are owners, a union is not necessary. The workers can hardly need to protect themselves against themselves. But as long as capitalist firms continue to exist, unions will be necessary for those employed by such firms. As an aside, in the where I live in Westerville, Ohio, there's a hardware store that's employee owned. And when you go in there, you see very young people, maybe in their early 20s, and they have a name tag and it says so-and-so, owner, and they're part owners of the business. And there's no reason that a model like this can't be widely replicated and become the norm in an economy. There is, however, another and less known form of worker organization, which is very important for a distributist economy, even though it's often not mentioned. And it will illustrate how some other matters might be handled in a distributist economy and society. This is something called, well, its best name is really the occupational group, but to give it a name that is more easily recognized, we can use the name guild. In the encyclical of the Pope that I've already quoted from, Quadragesimo Anno, Pius XI introduces the subject as follows. He writes, "For his nature induces those who dwell in close proximity to unite into municipalities. So those who practice the same trade or profession, economic or otherwise, constitute, as it were, fellowships or bodies. These groupings, autonomous in character, are considered by many to be, if not essential to civil society, at least a natural accompaniment thereof," unquote. In other words, those who work in the same industry or trade have certain common interests and needs, and most importantly, if their industry fulfills a legitimate human purpose, they cooperate in serving society's needs. In a minute, I will discuss more fully the implications of this, but for now, let me just say that in order to avoid, or at least to minimize, the dog-eat-dog kind of economy that capitalism fosters, it will be necessary to introduce some kind of formal cooperation. The guild or occupational group provides that businesses are grouped in a formal organization according to their common economic function. In other words, say, for example, grocers and other food suppliers would constitute an organization which not only would concern itself with common problems, much as trade associations do now, but would also have as their special concern, much that today is the concern of the government, for example, safety standards and product quality. The medieval guilds were as much concerned with quality workmanship and fair prices as they were with ensuring the steady supply of raw materials. They likewise instituted joint rules for the training of apprentices. Such guilds or occupational groups might provide for the health care of their members and families, establish retirement plans, and create banks or credit unions to provide for the financial needs of members. These guilds would not be departments of the government, but would be private, self-governing organizations. But anyone who wished to engage in a particular line of business would be obliged to become a member of his respective guild and abide by its decisions, which would be democratically arrived at. Of course, there would be general supervision by the government to ensure that no guild neglected its responsibilities to the public and to the common good and became merely a cartel. Hilaire Belloc speculated that it might be possible for a labor union to gradually be transformed into a true occupational group. He wrote, "Some of our greater trade unions today, though not officially chartered, have in practice attained many of the powers which an official charter would give. They, in practice, regulate wages, consider the opportunities of employment, prevent their function from being swamped with numbers, and in general substitute status and order for chaotic competition. It would be possible to begin by regularizing these few successful experiments, giving them a legal basis, and using them as models for extension into other fields." Excuse me. One of the keynotes of a distributive understanding of economics is the need for organization to foster cooperation, and the already existing labor unions could provide a basis for a more fully developed system of guilds. For unless there is some framework to promote cooperation and order in the economy, no matter how many small businesses or small farms we start out with, as long as we have free competition, excuse me, as long as we have free competition, there will be a tendency toward economic concentration and ultimately corporate economic domination. It is not enough to have well-distributed property if we do not take steps to keep it well-distributed. That is why any true system of distributism is not a form of libertarianism. For libertarianism necessarily allows for the concentrations of property, since its basic principle is that anything goes so long as it is not accomplished by force or fraud, both very narrowly defined. It is nothing but another form of capitalism, or at least would evolve into a form of capitalism, and would inevitably lead right back to where we are today, or to something worse. Another point worth talking about is the relationship of distributism with socialism. Many seem convinced that there is little or no difference between them. In fact, differences are crucial but complex. Socialism can be difficult to define because its specific policies have differed considerably over time and place. The socialism of the 19th century is not the socialism usually advocated today, but there are certain constants that persist in any genuine form of socialism, and I think we can rightfully speak of a spirit of socialism just as we speak of a spirit of capitalism. But before we examine what I mean by the spirit of socialism, let us look at some of the specific socialist economic proposals. I think that the evaluation of socialism made by Pope Pius XI in 1931 in the same encyclical might surprise many people today. He noted that in his time, socialism was split into two camps: communism, which had recently taken power in the Soviet Union, and more moderate socialism. After rejecting communism, Pope Pius went on to talk about moderate socialism. He wrote, quote, "It cannot be denied that the programs of moderate socialists often strikingly approach the just demands of Christian social reformers. For it is rightly contended that certain forms of property must be reserved to the state, since they carry with them an opportunity of domination too great to be left to private individuals without injury to the community at large," unquote. So if you look at the specific economic proposals of socialists, you will see some important overlaps with what any distributors could advocate. For example, advocacy of worker or cooperative ownership of large enterprises, advocacy of government ownership of certain industries such as utilities. These have been staples of socialism for some time. Well, in that case, why distributism then? Why not simply join our forces with the socialists? Well, for the very reason that Pius XI, while noting the similarity of many socialist economic proposals with Catholic social teaching, still gave a negative answer to the question of whether a Catholic could be a socialist. And the reason for that lies in the historic philosophical roots of socialism, which he identified with materialism and atheism. Its philosophic foundations, which it has never disavowed, are in a tradition, if not hostile to, at least alien to, any Christian or religious viewpoint. And because of their historical roots, they exhibit certain features that concern, or ought to concern, a distributist. For example, in the United States, socialism does not seem entirely comfortable with individual ownership of productive property. To take an historical example, in the 1912 presidential campaign, the party's campaign book proclaimed that the Socialist Party believes the time has now come for the beginning of socially operated farms. These farms would be sufficiently large to use the most improved machinery. They would be officered and directed by the socially trained graduates of our agricultural educational institutions, unquote. And the official party platform of that year advocated the collective ownership of land whenever practicable. I don't think that somebody like Wendell Berry would be happy with either of these ideas, and they certainly are reminiscent of the Soviet collective farms. Although the current platform of the Democratic Socialists of America does acknowledge small farms, it says little or nothing about small businesses. G.K. Chesterton once quipped that the only difference between socialism and big business is who your boss is to be, and the statements of socialist parties gives them credence to that idea. Moreover, the Democratic Socialists of America also proclaim as part of their platform free abortion on demand. In fact, the Chicago chapter of the Democratic Socialists sells T-shirts with the slogan, free abortion on demand without apology. Nor have they ever escaped from the Marxist tradition. Now, I am the first to admit that there are things we can learn from Karl Marx, but that oughtn't to make us Marxists. And in addition to recommending for study works of Marx and Engels on their website, which is proper, as I said, they also recommend Lenin's book, State and Revolution, as well. So while we can agree with socialists about certain specific reforms, we cannot be socialists. I should note, however, that this does not mean that everyone who has ever called himself a socialist is necessarily a materialist or an atheist or is suspicious of private property, but rather that the movement, historically considered, as a whole has been. Thus, it is noteworthy and important that the American Solidarity Party specifically places itself in a different intellectual tradition, in the tradition of Christian democracy, a tradition of robust thinking about socio-economic matters that has very different philosophical roots from socialism, even when there is agreement about between us and socialists about certain specifics. And incidentally, I might add that John Paul II, in his encyclical Testimus Annus, situates the intellectual roots of capitalism right likewise in atheism, a point that might surprise many of our fellow citizens. Nor does distributism have anything to do with fascism, as some stupidly have asserted. Actually, very few Americans appear to have the faintest idea of what, historically, fascism was, and it's used pretty much simply as a meaningless term of abuse. But distributism, with its emphasis on subsidiarity or decentralization, has nothing to do with historic fascism. It would be fascinating to talk more about the philosophical roots of the different political philosophies and how two or more political movements can advocate for similar policies and especially make similar critiques, and yet have widely different fundamental social orientations. Moreover, for the most part, these differing political movements are concomitant with differing cultural movements, which manifest themselves in quite surprising ways. Today, for example, the political divide in the United States, in many respects, is really a cultural divide. And very often one's adherence to one side or the other is based more on a distaste for the cultural atmosphere of the one's other side than on account of specific political proposals that they make. But this would take me too far afield to go into now. Now, to switch in a little bit to the subject of economics. I'm sure that some of you who are listening to me tonight have studied economics, at least on the elementary level. Economics, in the tradition descending from Adam Smith, which is what you almost always will encounter if you study economics today, simply assumes the separation between ownership and work. Likewise, it assumes that economics is about the allocating of scarce resources according to the presumed desires of each individual economic actor to become rich. The economy does not exist to provide for humanity's needs, but to fulfill our individual desires. The late Paul Samuelson, Nobel Prize winner in economics and author of probably the most used economic text in the world, basing his analysis on the supposed scarcity of economic goods, put it in this way, quoting here from his book, Microeconomics. A situation of scarcity is one in which goods are limited relative to desires. An objective observer would have to agree that, even after 2 centuries of rapid economic growth, production in the United States is simply not high enough to meet everyone's desires. If you add up all the wants, we'll quickly find that there are simply not enough goods and services to satisfy even a small fraction of everyone's consumption desires. Our national output would have to be many times larger before the average American could live at the level of the average doctor or big league baseball player, unquote. Now here you can see the thinking that underlies the understanding of economic activity that capitalism has created. First, there is no distinction between needs and wants. Secondly, it is simply taken for granted that every American would like to live at the level of the average doctor or big league baseball player. And even if this is true in the case of most Americans, is this really a constant of human nature? Or is it something which our cultural norms have taught us? Namely, that the purpose of life is simply the amassing of goods and pleasures according to our individual preferences and desires. This brings us to our second way of talking about distributism. I mentioned a different rhythm of life. You will have noticed that the institutions of the distributist economy, primarily widely distributed property and guilds, have a very different aim and presuppose a very different understanding of the economy than that of capitalism. Instead of a means for enabling everyone to live at the level of the average doctor or big league baseball player, distributists see the economy as a means for providing the human race as a whole with the goods and services necessary for a truly human life. This does not mean becoming as rich as possible. And so at the outset, we introduce the distinction between needs and wants, something which Samuelson and those who think like him refuse to do, because they presuppose a radical individualism in which each individual understanding of reality and his desires are the norm on which both the economy and society as a whole are based. But distributism understands not just the economy but society, and indeed human life as a whole is governed by a different rhythm, a rhythm in which cooperation and not competition are the foundations of the society, of the economy and society. The common good, the good of the entire community, is recognized as primary, and our individual goods find their proper places within the common good, not as opposed to it. If distributism simply meant a different structure of ownership, then distributist entities might well be just as cutthroat in their dealings with other businesses and with consumers as capitalists often are. But for a distributist, those making the same product should not be seen as competitors, but as engaged in a joint activity to supply some necessary human need, as we've already talked about. Obviously, this does not mean that producers aren't concerned with making a profit, but it does mean that as long as each producer is making sufficient to support himself and his family in a reasonable manner, that should be enough. And instead of striving to expand this business to make more and more, we should turn our attention to those things of greater importance, to our families, to intellectual and cultural activities, to our spiritual lives. This is what life is really about, not about living at the level of the average doctor or big league baseball player. Obviously, we are far from being able to create a distributed economy all at once. A tremendous task of education lies ahead of us. But this task of education and changing of attitudes must go hand in hand with changing the laws. This is admittedly difficult and one that goes against much of what our culture has exemplified and teaches. But there are steps, both small steps and potentially larger steps, which we could take to work toward distributism. Obviously, shopping at and encouraging small businesses, farmers markets, worker-owned businesses is one step that almost anyone can take. Depending on our vocations, our opportunities, our contacts, and so on, we can work to introduce into public discussion some of the other ideas and proposals that I've touched on today, such as favorable tax treatment for small startups or tax breaks when an owner converts his business into an employee-owned firm. Some of these already exist or have been proposed in a limited way. I wish I could set forth a detailed 5-year or even 10-year plan to convert our economy, our whole society even, into something akin to distributism, but this is not going to be something so simple or quick. In the 1930s, there was considerable radical economic thinking in the United States, caused, of course, by the Depression and the recognition that things weren't working well. In the Catholic Church, there was much more recognition and acceptance of the Church's social doctrine, and one wasn't immediately labeled a socialist or a communist for voicing harsh criticisms of capitalism. Now, however, the sharp division of most politically active Americans into liberal and conservative tribes has made many Christians associate any criticism of capitalism with advocacy of positions that are clearly contrary to Christian teaching. By and large, in the United States, the Catholic hierarchy does not have a keen sense of economic justice or much understanding of the issue. If they think about it at all, they are likely to frame the question merely in terms of less or more government regulation, which is only one small part of the social question, and to avoid any really radical critique, such as distributists make. So, speaking as a Catholic, the Church has a really robust tradition of thinking about economic justice, and one important thing we can do is to acquaint ourselves with it. In this way, we can show skeptics that a severe Catholic critique of capitalism is nothing new, nothing that is a result of merely the last few decades of Catholic life. Indeed, the strictures against capitalist and capitalism found in earlier documents, including papal documents, often make the criticisms of today seem quite mild in comparison. So this introduces the question of how we are to engage with skeptical or even with sympathetic but unsure friends or acquaintances on the subject of distributism. Earlier this year, I was talking with someone who asked me how distributism differed from communism. Doesn't it mean, he said, that the government will confiscate all property and redistribute it according to some bureaucratic scheme? Now, I've already spoken tonight about how the root differences between distributism and socialism lie in our differing philosophical commitments. However, I suspect that if you explain this, it will not do much to placate people worried about government confiscation. So in the first place, you can simply tell such people that distributism does not mean confiscation of property by the government or redistribution according to a bureaucratic scheme. But I fear that often this too will not be enough to reassure them. And in many cases, this is because their understanding of property is rooted in the Lockean understanding of private property as an absolute right. For many people, many Americans especially, any discussion of limitations on property or of the social duties of property will sound strange and be immediately labeled as some kind of socialism. Nor is there any recognition of the differing types of property ownership, which I've already mentioned. The ownership of homes and farms, for example, bears an immediate relationship to the common good, something that ownership of shares of stock does not. I am not advocating confiscations of stocks, but I am pointing out that we need to think hard about each form of property and how it contributes to or impedes the common good. And as a result, what kinds of regulations and restrictions ought to be in place for that particular kind of property. There are many methods by which we can work toward a distributist economy, but someone who thinks private property is an absolute right, having no relationship to the common good, will likely be suspicious of any of them, even the most mild. Hilaire Belloc's scheme planned to tax concentrations of property that probably many of you are familiar with at an extremely high rate in order to compel a sell-off of concentrated property is not the only method of working toward distributism. While I do not think that Belloc's proposals are unjust, obviously there is no possible way we can have a serious discussion of anything like that today. But generally, I think that the first step in any discussion with a hostile or suspicious questioner is to talk about the purpose of the economy, to try to show that the economy, as a crucial part of our social life, must be subordinated to the overall common good. This is very hard for people to grasp or accept, and of course immediately raises fears of socialism. In part, of course, this is due to ignorance of both what the church teaches and of how, historically, the economies of pre-capitalist Europe operated. Sadly, it's probably not going to be a quick job. It would take a certain amount of willingness on the part of your questioner to learn, since the absolutist concept of private property is very deeply ingrained in the American consciousness. Now, related to this is the idea that somehow our economy would be ruined if we were to take steps toward distributism. In too many minds, it is assumed that it is capitalism that is responsible for the plenitude of goods that we enjoy or suffer from, and that whatever is false, any alternative to capitalism in the long run means poverty. And related to that, there is the idea that distributism is identified with the slogan, 3 acres and a cow, with everyone being a subsistence farmer and living a harsh life, probably without electricity or even without a smartphone. Now, Chesterton never offered 3 acres and a cow as a definition of distributism, but naturally most people don't know that. In the 2009 debate at Nassau Community College on Long Island, where I represented distributism and Michael Novak represented capitalism, Novak asked me, how could you have airplanes with distributism? Now, I've already mentioned the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, producers of numerous sophisticated industrial and consumer products, which are worker-owned companies. And I see no reason why they couldn't manufacture airplanes if they wanted to. After all, what would change with a distributed airplane factory? Not the workers, neither engineers nor welders, but only the way the company was organized. The idea that capitalists are uniquely qualified to run businesses is, I think, hardly borne out by history. And in any case, in corporate America, it is usually not the owners, the capitalists, who run their businesses, but hired managers. If these managers are all that effective, I see no reason why they couldn't work in a distributist model, performing much the same function they do now, and being part owners of the companies they presently control. So I don't think that, technologically speaking, we have anything to fear from the distributist orientation of our economy. And when we look at the actual record of capitalism, we see a huge number of failed and bankrupt companies, which doesn't give one much confidence in our present way of managing things and running an economy. Now, capitalism has an inherent tendency to overreach, to exhaust its resources. That is because, like so much of modern thought, capitalism prescinds from any notion of purpose. There is never enough with capitalism because there is never a goal, never anything aimed at, never anything to be satisfied with. If you don't have a goal, you never have enough. You never know what you're aiming at. So in capitalism, if you're rich, well, you can always be even richer. That this is ridiculous, and because ridiculous and immoral, should be obvious. In a way, the fight for distributism against capitalism is a fight to overturn the entire modern project, the project of autonomous individuals whose actions are restrained by nothing except what is self-chosen and self-willed. You can see the difficulty of this task, and in the end, I think that it will never succeed without a fundamental reorientation of our thinking, even perhaps without a religious conversion. But that is another topic for another time and place, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. That was very informative. I believe now we can open it up to question and answer. Is that all right?
Yes, please.
All right. So if any of our people viewing would like to ask a question, go ahead and unmute, and you can ask Mr. Thomas Storck.
A basic for everybody is housing. And I'm lucky enough to at least own 4/5 of my house. I'm getting older in age. I'm almost done. If I could just get a job again, I'd be done paying it off in about 5 years. But that's not something everybody has a chance at these days, especially after the housing crisis. It occurs to me that we've got about 250 million acres under BLM. Privatizing BLM would could easily provide a birthright quarter acre to every American. It seems like that would be a better answer than confiscating land from people who currently own it.
Well, it seems to me there are two aspects to this question, if I understand it rightly. My understanding is that the land that the Bureau of Land Management manages is supposedly, I'm not saying this is always true or even mostly true, I really don't know, but it's the intent of it is that it's managed in some way in the public interest or for recreation or for conservation or something like that. Is that correct?
To some extent,
ostensibly,
yes. Although here in Oregon, a large amount of it was just land that people tried to make a go on and then failed for some reason. lots of it was a lot of it was originally the Homesteading Act land,
Okay.
but that people failed to improve within the required 5 years, and then it went back to the BLM, and then nobody did anything with it after that.
Well, yeah, if there's land that's suitable, say, for farming or for some kind of settlement or something, there's absolutely no reason why it can't be taken, sold off from the BLM. I agree. I mean, but it's a matter of case by case analysis of each thing. I don't think you can say, yes, get rid of all the BLM land or most of it or 80% of it or whatever. But I live in the East, so I don't encounter that as much as you. I live in the well,
Yeah, out here in the West, there's huge tracts of just nothing.
But as long as it's not done irresponsibly, or it's not done in a way to benefit simply those who have currently hold economic power, in principle, and I emphasize that in principle, I suppose that could be done, yeah, and it might be reasonable in many instances. I think there are other things that can be done to help the housing situation. One is, for example, curbing one way or the other speculation in housing. People buying, corporations buying up housing and holding it for rental property at a high rate, for example. But what you say about the BLM, yeah, in principle, would seem like that would be reasonable.
Mr. Storck, I had a question about guilds. I'm not familiar with the structure of guilds. Could you explain that more?
Yeah, the guild was it was a very characteristic in the medieval urban economy, and actually they lasted in many places, well, especially in Germany, even up until the 19th century. And the idea was that the different producers of a particular product, say bakers, were performing a joint service to the public, and they had interests in common. One of those interests was obviously adequate supply of raw materials, adequate training of new employees, apprentices, and so on. But they also were concerned with product quality and with fair prices. So they would be democratically run. They would have meetings and they would elect their officials and so on. They would inspect the different workshops to make sure that the product quality was adequate, and they would set prices. Set prices on the grounds of the producer had to have an adequate reward to support his business, his family, but the public wasn't going to be overcharged. So they performed some of the economic functions that we associate with the government today, but they went beyond that because they were, for example, they set prices, as I said. It wasn't just simply supply and demand, and they were very effective when in their heyday, and even afterwards. They decayed for a variety of reasons. Partly when governments in early modern Europe began orienting the economy toward enhancement of royal power instead of local economies, and they usually only had authority within a particular city. So if you started a bakery in a particular city, then you had to be a member of the guild. But if you moved out into the country and started a bakery, then you didn't have to be a member of the guild. And that was one way they were undermined, that capitalists would start a business outside the city, and then they were not bound by the guild rules. And they could undercut the guild by lower prices. But these lower prices were accompanied by usually lower wages for the workers, and often by poorer quality products, which is always a tendency. When you are competing with somebody else, then there's really only a couple things you can do to lower your costs. One is wage costs. That's always something you think about lowering. The other is quality costs. You can't really lower too much what you pay to your suppliers, because if you do, they'll go out of business. You can't lower your fixed costs like electricity or rent or things like that. but you can lower product quality and you can lower wages. And these were two things that the guilds were particularly concerned with supervising.
One of the other big things guilds provided was, long before there were public schools, was education. They all the guilds had apprenticeship programs. And
Yes, they did.
That's where they got their lower, in some ways, that was where they got their lower wage workers. But the idea was you were training to be, to eventually own a business within the guild.
Yeah, that's good. That's correct. Yeah, there were apprentices, and they weren't being compensated at the same level as the owners. But as Theodore said, the idea was that they would be owners eventually. They weren't being exploited for their whole life. Now, some people didn't want to have their own business, and they were content. The second stage was journeyman. And if you graduated from being an apprentice, you became a journeyman. And there were some people who were content to remain journeymen for their whole lives. But the idea was that they could become owners, masters, if they wanted to. And as Theodore pointed out, they had a lot of non-economic activities, not just educational programs in the craft, but they had, for example, they often would own their own chapel. They would have a chapel and pray, say mass for their members, and they would hold annual dinners and things like that. It was a very like a combination of a labor union, a trade association, and a fraternal society.
I have a question. In our capitalistic, materialistic culture, is there a danger that guilds could function almost like a monopoly?
Oh yeah. There's of course with any human activity, there's always that danger. And some of the guilds, even in the past, degenerated into certain aspects of that. We have to admit that. But it's not a question of can I come up with a scheme? Can anybody come up with a scheme that's perfect? No. Can you come up with a scheme or an idea or a plan that is going to incentivize good behavior rather than incentivizing bad behavior? The co-founder of the Catholic Worker, Peter Marin, used to say he wanted a society in which it was easier to be good. In other words, in capitalism, if let's say you start a business with the highest ideals, highest ethical ideals, well, you may find yourself in competition with somebody who doesn't have the highest ethical ideals. And what are you going to do? Well, you could fold up and close your business, or you can sink to his level. But when every other producer is, at least theoretically, held to high ideals, then you have some chance of working those high ideals yourself. But yeah, of course there's that possibility.
Thank you. I believe we have maybe 15 more minutes on this call. I'm not positive, but if there are more questions, please go ahead and unmute and ask.
Yeah, this is Phil. Thanks, Thomas, for the talk. So can you, switching gears a little bit, can you compare and contrast, as you did with some social or other political philosophies, but distributism with the progressive era in the early 20th century in the United States?
Yeah, it's the progressive era was, I'm not an expert in the progressive era. I know there were different elements in it. For example, in the 1912 presidential campaign that Woodrow Wilson won, he was emphasizing breaking up monopolies. And that was the campaign that Teddy Roosevelt was running on his third party, the Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party. And he had some very interesting ideas, namely to, instead of breaking up large businesses, to give them federal charters and exempt them from the antitrust laws, but to regulate them very closely under a charter to make sure that they were operating toward the public good. And this has certain elements with certain statements in papal social teaching. And I don't know if you've ever heard of an economist by the name of Heinrich Pesch, who died, a German Jesuit who died in 1926, I believe it was. who came up with a system of economics called solidarism, which has a lot of overlap with distributism. But Father Pesch emphasized certain things in common with the progressive era. But I think the main difference between the progressive era's thought and the distributists was that the distributists, especially the original distributists, were thinking in terms of small businesses, small farms, small workshops. Nowadays, with our economy being consisting mostly of larger entities, at least initially, it would be probably necessary to have more worker-owned larger enterprises than it would be small ones, because the small ones just don't exist, and it would take a while for them to get going.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it probably doesn't answer your question as well as I could, but as I said, I'm not really an expert on the progressive thought in detail.
No, I appreciate your thoughts, sir. And yeah, I mean the breaking up, I think there's commonality. I mean, I'll defer to you, but I think the commonality of breaking up the concentration of power. Teddy Roosevelt being known as a trust buster. Any high school, middle school civics class would cover that. So no, that's helpful. And how do you spell Father Pesch's name? I had not heard of him.
P-E-S-C-H.
P-E-S-C-H. Okay, thank you, sir.
Now, one thing I will mention that for Wilson and for the Democratic platform in 1912, the breaking up of trusts was simply a means of introducing competition again. So that would be one definite way that it would differ with a guild-based economy, which sees competition as having a very, very limited role, if any, because as I said, when you compete, you immediately want to cut costs. And there are only a certain number of ways you can do that.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Kind of along the same lines here, we seem to have a corporatist capture of all of our retirement accounts. That our retirement accounts, the money flow seems to flow from my retirement account into a owner of corporate stock. How would you propose, or what kind of proposals would there be as an alternative for that type of retirement account, in a way that would at least keep the spirit of it alive, but allow for people to be saving for retirement and then maybe starting their own business?
Well, as I said, I mentioned briefly, if you had a full-scale institution of guilds, occupational groups, then a lot of these things could be handled by them, including, I think, retirement could be handled by them. And of course, they would not be profit making. That's one of the things if you contrast, for example, we have Medicare, and we also have a Medicare backup plan. Now, Medicare pays 80% of our health things, and the backup pays the rest of Blue Cross Blue Shield. Well, Medicare is much cheaper than the other, even though it's 80% pays 80%, and the other only pays 20%, because the other is interested in costs, in profits rather. And even though I guess theoretically Blue Cross is nonprofit, in practice it doesn't operate like that. Now, the same is true for all these other, even more so true for the pension funds that are invested on Wall Street and so on, because they're going to take whoever's managing them is going to take a chunk, and maybe a big chunk. And so, as I say, it seems like there's all these different things that need to be done at once, and in a way that's true. But until you produce a different spirit and take steps, and you can start taking steps toward instituting, say, some kind of a guild system. But I admit we're very far from that right now, and there's not a whole lot you can do right now. Although I'm sure there are different reforms, and if I were an expert in pension fund law, I could tell you some, but I don't I'm not.
This is by no means a perfect answer, especially not from a distributist standpoint. But the first thing I did when I got laid off from Intel was moved my retirement fund into a Knights of Columbus annuity that invests in church mortgages. I figure the Catholic, I can't think of a safer place for it. Catholic Church has been in business for 1,950 years, give or take a few decades. They ain't going out soon. Unlike the stock market.
Yeah.
John, are we going to 7 o'clock? It just turned 7.
Yeah, I think we have 7 minutes left on the till I believe it ends, but so we can have another maybe 1 or 2 more questions in that time, or we can end it.
Okay.
So Thomas, and I guess I'll open it up to others. So this is, so as a Catholic who has, friends who, are, yeah, I think have unrestrained capitalism in the American consciousness is certainly ingrained in them. What would be the best way to evangelize or reintroduce, and a lot of my friends I'm thinking of are, otherwise, I mean, we're good Catholic men, right? So I'm just trying to think, what would you recommend, not just for men, of course, but even for women, and just in terms of reaching out to folks and turning them onto this, to get reacquainted with the church's tradition here?
Well, probably the best way, if they're willing to accept that the church has any authority to teach in the social economic order, the best way is to introduce them to the papal encyclicals, which are not always that easy to understand when you first read them. But my favorite one is the 1931 encyclical of Pope Pius XI, called Quadragesimo Anno, which was written to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. And it is an extremely wide-ranging and hard-hitting encyclical that contains some rather severe criticisms of capitalism and capitalists. And people would be quite surprised to realize that kind of stuff was being uttered by popes. It's not something that's just the last 10 years. And there's a book, many Catholics who are trying to be Orthodox, like, for example, Fulton Sheen. Well, Fulton Sheen wrote a book, actually it was a series of radio talks he gave back in the 30s called Justice and Charity, which is available, I believe, now from the American Chesterton Society. Is that right, David? I'm not sure. Anyway.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Anyway, Fulton Sheen was quite critical of capitalism in those talks. And if you can show them that the historic Catholic position has been what people now would see as rather radical, sometimes you can get them to start questioning the ingrained American attitudes they have and say, hey, I didn't realize this. This is something new. As a matter of fact, I don't want to step on anyone's toes here one way or the other. I went to my wife and I attended the traditional Latin Mass for many years. And from right now, we're not doing that for various reasons. But I found among people attending the Latin Mass, because many of them took Catholic teaching seriously, I found, I think, a higher percentage of people who called themselves distributists than you would find in an average parish, which was quite interesting, I thought. So the fault lines, if you will, of division are often not what people would expect.
That's interesting. So you're saying that folks who attended, the pre-Vatican II, they tended to be distributist?
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. I would say okay. I found some among them who understood distributism and were explicitly committed to it, whereas I think in an ordinary parish that would be rather hard to find.
Understood.
I'm sure the exceptions do exist, and as I said, we don't we don't go to the traditional Latin Mass right at present for a variety of reasons, mostly connected with distance. But we did for a number of years.
Okay, understood. Thank you again, Thomas, for the talk and answering mine and everybody else's questions.
Oh, well, thank you very much for coming, for listening.
Sure.
May I, as you all can see on the screen here, Mr. David Cooney there, and he is the editor of a website called Practical Distributism. And so I would recommend that if you want to follow up on distributism, I would recommend that as a source for distributist thinking. And the Distributist Review is no longer publishing new material, but it still has archives that are present.
Yes, and I would also say that there is a page on my site that has it's called resources, and it has links to all sorts of books that cover various topics, including Catholic social teaching that applies to distributism. And I try to keep those links up to date. I check them every now and then to see if the URLs have changed, but they are there.
Could you put your website in the chat?
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Thank you. Well, Tom, I really appreciate it. I'm sure we all appreciate you coming and sharing with us. It's been very informative and very provocative, I guess. So that's great.
Well, thank you. I'm honored by being invited. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely. There's not any other questions. Any other questions before we close off?
Oh, thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks again, Tom. Really
Okay, thank you.
have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
David, I'll be in touch with the
Yeah.
call copy.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
So I want to thank Thomas Storck for taking the time to talk to our Cascadia chapter. And I also want to thank Jeremy Miller and John Montgomery for organizing that talk. Hopefully it was efficacious for you all, and everyone watching it tonight enjoyed it. We've got 3 more events tonight. At 6 p.m. Eastern, we will be broadcasting a conversation between Amar Patel and Chuck Marone of Strong Towns. At 8 p.m., we'll be broadcasting a conversation between Jeremy Darling and Maria Marek of the Christian Democrats of Sweden. And then at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight, we have a keynote with our vice presidential candidate, Lauren Onak. So please make sure to tune in for those. And we hope that you're enjoying the speaker series. And we look forward to the future events. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.